Well, thank you everybody for joining. This is John Elfie from the National Governors Association, and we are very excited for everyone being able to join us today and to be here with you all. So to kick it off, we have several people on this call today that will be presenting. First, myself, I'm a policy analyst at NGA, and I do a lot of work focused on just general governor's priorities and a bit of post-secondary as well. We also have Scott Palmer, who is the managing partner and co-founder here at EducationCounsel, and who also previously worked in the White House as a policy advisor and at the U.S. Department of Education as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights. We have Nick Moore from Alabama, who is a current policy advisor for Governor Ivey. You can see waving on the screen with his wonderful tie and suspenders there, and who also worked in education policy for former Senator Luther Strange and Representative Roby from Alabama. And to my left, we have Lindsey, who is the current Director of Policy and Development and State Government Relations for the Alliance for Excellent Education, and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Ed, and a GEPA for former Governor Jack Markell from Delaware. And then we have Cara over here, who unfortunately you can't see, but she is running all of our wonderful tech today, so thank you so much. So we wanted to put this webinar together just for a little bit of background. During the transition, NGA and EducationCounsel worked together to craft a strategic memo for specifically new GEPAs, but really any policy advisors in general that we recently included in one of our news blasts that provided a framework for new advisors that could use for their first few jobs on the month to help them think through some of the decisions that they'd be making. Following the memo's release, we thought that we would potentially be able to give GEPAs a more in-depth opportunity to engage by holding a webinar like this, hence we designed this series. So strategically placing it at the end of a couple of big slates of legislative sessions to try and make sure that it was timely and accessible to folks. So first we'll be hearing from Scott from EducationCounsel on an overview of the transitions memo and the framework we devised. Then jump back to me and I'll provide a brief overview of some of the various services we can offer to you at NGA. And then we'll hear from Nick and Lindsey as they talk about some of their experience as policy advisors, and you get a chance to ask some questions of them. So with that, I will hand it off to Scott.
I was so efficient. Good afternoon, everyone. So I was reflecting that we're coming up on almost our 2-decade anniversary here at EducationCounsel, which is really shocking. And over that time, we've had a chance to work with almost every state in thinking about how to move policy forward. I also, early in my career, got to work briefly in the Maryland governor's office, so appreciate a little bit of the experience that so many of you have and are bringing. We also have had asked on several occasions to help states with transition, and I had a chance to work on a federal transition. And as we were talking with NGA, we thought it might be really useful to think about what are some of the things we've learned and some of the things that might be helpful in helping new GEPAs in particular think about how to approach this transition. Obviously, that time has quickly flown by, but I think it is true that some of the things that we identified as being important and uniquely in the wheelhouse of governors remain true beyond the transition period, that they're actually a useful set of things to think about even as you're going in through that first year and setting up for a successful 4 years or beyond. So it's in that spirit that we will offer some of these observations, and I will endeavor to change slides and hope I don't mess things up simultaneously, which I might. Oh, thank you very much. Okay. So if we go one more forward, I think this is the sort of arc of what we're going to cover on this call. Let's go one more slide. And this is just to remind you how to work the webinar logistics. There's several ways to chat with us, including just speaking when we open it up, but also there's a chat box if you want to enter comments as we go. Next slide. This is who we are. We look even better in person, so let's keep moving. And I'm going to talk a little bit, therefore, about just 10 things that we suggest that folks look out for. Before I do, if you go one slide further, I'll just add one other point, which may or may not seem obvious to you as you're, some period into your work now, but I will say that hopefully it's a really good and exciting time to be a GEPA. There's a lot happening in terms of evolution, I think, in the education agenda, devolution in authority back to states and districts that creates both a lot of opportunity and responsibility. And I would argue actually a lot more we know than we've ever known before from the science of learning and development and from research and evidence and other things about what might really move the needle. So I know there's a challenge of riches, but hopefully this is all offered under the heading that it's a great time to think about these issues, and hopefully this helps. I will also say from my last experience that if I can just talk quickly and get you to Nick and Lindsey and their real world experience, you'll really hear something valuable. So I'm going to do this in like a lightning round, and then we can always come back if at all useful. So if we flip forward, we originally talked about these issues in the context of a transition, and we're trying to point out that there's both a transition period and then a first 100 days, and how do they relate to each other. But notice that the end of the curve, never goes down. It just sort of continues to the right, and the idea being that hopefully these lessons continue to be of use. If we go to the next slide, we sort of built them underneath it, but one more, and then maybe people can see them most clearly. One more slide. Perfect. So we're just going to talk through these quickly, and let me say, like in so much of policy or governance, they individually or collectively are not necessarily rocket science, but it also does hopefully help to think about them clearly, to have that affirmation, to ask yourself, have we really done each of these things, or are variant of those things? Every context is different. And if not, how and why, and would it be valuable to attend to? So very briefly, number one, have you established education as a clear priority in the state? Again, I think this is a unique role for a governor. There's limited room on the decision agenda. How is the governor clearly using visible time, voice, proposal, budget to really signal education as a priority? And is it one, and how is it one relative to other important priorities in the state? Second, how can you work to then set a clear vision of what's most important and where you're trying to go? That could be a vision of what you want all children and students to know and be able to do, what you want all parents and families to be able to access, what you want to be the sort of signature focus for the administration. But again, I think a unique pulpit from which to try to do that. Third, and obvious, that the governor likely has an important role to play in appointing or working with various leaders in education across the state. I will say that acknowledging that every state's governance structure is different. I like to say that on the spectrum of functional to dysfunctional, none of you are on the functional side of the governance system, but somewhere on that dysfunctional side, you will have important roles to play in appointments and sometimes even structures that cross agencies and other things. So thinking about those leadership and that talent is obviously critical. Fourth is around, obviously, stakeholder engagement. This is one of those areas where it's felt widely and deeply. And so whether that's thinking about how you're engaging critical state legislators, or how are you engaging critical field leaders in the teacher or principal or parent and family space, it's important to kind of keep that as something that has both formal mechanisms more and more, advisory groups, regular touch base, as well as informal as you move around the state. Fifth, then, how are you really looking at the state's specific context in education and more broadly, and thinking about what image emerges from a look at those data and those examples? Very often, it's not until you're in office that you really get to look under the hood and see what is really happening and where are the bright spots and the challenges, and then really making sure that that's clear and continues over time can be really helpful. Sixth, even as we're going to get to the idea of your particular priorities, you also inherit very much political as well as sometimes real responsibility for more of the day-to-day implementation. So understanding where things stand in that regard, so you both can be proactive and, not surprised by issues that might exist, whether that's issues related to federal compliance or state implementation or other things. I think getting a handle on that can be really important. And I think you'll hear about the importance of relationships and conversations around getting and maintaining that. Seven, then once you get a better sense of the context and issues and what's true in the state, what do you know from leading research and lessons from the field about what it might take to move the needle on those issues? And again, I think there's a lot more there than we've ever had before. Happy to come back to that. Number eight, obviously, then, you are in a unique position to set some critical education policy priorities. Those could be short or long-term, early wins or larger shifts that you want to achieve over the course of a legislative cycle or a political cycle. Number nine, don't forget those partners and resources, again, who can help you move that. Some of the most effective states have really good inside-outside partnerships, organizations that have their own political capital that can help carry some of the weight, bridge transitions, other things. And then there's also the national or regional players that, you shouldn't under leverage if you think they can be helpful. And then finally, and forgive the rapidity of all this, think about whether you can try to plan for both the kind of culture and structures around continuous improvement. It is rare, if ever, that we find a problem, we do a policy, we enact it, and then everything goes perfectly and you never have to come back to it again, right? These are much bigger challenges than that. So the more you can think about what are your opportunities to not only lead with new ideas, but lead with improvement of continuing ideas or other things that can be really helpful, that continuous improvement piece can be a big driver. So again, nothing here necessarily surprising or rocket science, but hopefully it's a way for you to think about where are you on the arc of attending to some of these things? What do they mean in your state context? And I think as you hear from Nick and Lindsey, they'll try to make this more real and actionable in terms of day-to-day advice. There is a federal context and update. My suggestion might be that we come back to this if we have time and stay on the focus of the transition and the structure. Would that be okay to you guys? It felt like a little bit of a tangent last time, and we can come back to it. The one thing I would say is don't forget in your state role, you also have a critical role in understanding how to leverage and ensure compliance and use of federal funds and other things. And so the federal still matters, and happy to give our sense of the update, but we can come back to it if there's time available.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay. So let's go one more.
All right.
Great.
Well, I'm going to jump back in here and just give a quick overview of NGA and some of the work that we're doing, and then we'll pass it off to the folks, as Scott said, who have the real knowledge here and experience to give you guys. But just a brief overview of NGA. So the National Governors Association is split into a number of different areas. These are not all of them, but these are some of the ones that you may potentially utilize in your roles. We have NGA Advocacy, which in the federal context is most of our advocacy work up on Capitol Hill and within the federal agencies. We have NGA Consulting, which provides leadership assistance from election day through the final year in office for governors and their spouses. And then NGA Solutions, which is where NGA Education, the division that I am a part of, is housed. So within NGA Education, we have 4 total divisions that focus on a number of different policy areas. And if you can click to the next slide, you can see right now we actually have 8 staff. We have someone who recently came on board who will also be filling out a K-12 position. But anyone up there, you can get a general sense of who we are, our titles, and our contact information. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to go ahead and reach out to us. We are as responsive as we can possibly be, and we'll do everything we can to try and assist you in the various ways that we are able. So on the next slide, just give you a brief overview of some of the services we offer. So one of the things that we do is called a governor's response team, which these are rapid response teams that support staff in answering urgent questions, drawing on our expertise and our national partners, like the alliance over here with Lindsey. That includes site visits, technical assistance memos, and facilitating connections to experts in the field. For an example, recently that we assisted with, actually Nick here on the call, Alabama and Montana, we recently brought them together for Governor Bullock to come and visit Governor Ivey in Alabama to talk some about early education. Technical assistance, as I already mentioned, we do some technical assistance memos, but this really more broadly helps guide states through policy development and implementation that's tailored to meet the needs of each individual state and context. This can include a variety of different kinds of meetings and really is tailored to whatever the specific needs of the state would be. For example, we've done some strengthening of educator support systems in states like California, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Iowa with some technical assistance memos. We also provide ongoing learning opportunities through our monthly newsletter, as well as various e-blasts, webinars like this one. We recently started a podcast series on teacher leadership and school leadership that folks can tune into. We've gotten some good reviews on that so far, and then various other tools as well. And then last but not least, we have a number of national convenings that we will hold across the country and here in DC. These are areas such as our Fall Policy Institute that provides content information and networking opportunities with experts in the field to discuss best practices. So some of the ones we have upcoming in the very near future are on August 4th through 6th, we'll have a Charter Schools Learning Collaborative. And then on October 20th through the 22nd, we will have a convening around social emotional learning and whole child. And we will also be in later September having our yearly Governor's Education Policy Advisors Institute. And so keep an eye out for the save the date that should be coming out in the very near future. On the next slide, I'm not going to go into detail of all the things that we do here, but you can get a sense of just looking down this list. This is from our strategic vision that we started in 2017 and goes through 2020 of the various projects that we are currently working on. So just a couple to highlight again, under Whole Child, the social emotional learning is coming up, and then the charter schools convening. If either of those sound of interest to you, feel free to reach out after the webinar if you'd like some more information. And then lastly, what we want to do is we just want to give folks a brief kind of overview of some of the major content areas and priorities that we've seen in our work with governors' public statements so far. So as a little bit of background, starting this last July, we started to monitor public statements that were being made by governors across the country and building out just a database of these various statements to use that for our internal planning work and then to help connect governors' offices to other states that were approaching similar policies in a similar way. So again, these are all public statements. So just right here, this is the number of governors mentioning since January 1st, 2019. In this particular area, this is early childhood education. You can see issues like pre-K, kindergarten, as well as childcare, early education workforce, and prenatal to 3 are high priorities for a lot of governors. In the K-12 space, a lot of focus on issues of K-12 funding. I would say almost every governor has made some type of statement around this. Human capital, issues like teacher compensation, benefits, training, recruitment, effectiveness, you can see all up and down the list are a very high focus area. And then also the workforce alignment with career and technical education, as well as issues of school safety, counseling and mental health, social emotional learning pop up a lot in K-12 as well. In post-secondary, a lot of focus around a couple of different areas. I'd say affordability with financial aid, student debt, tuition. You have access-focused policies with free college programs, early college programs, and community colleges, and then that post-secondary workforce connection with issues like college workforce alignment policies, and then issues of adult learning as well. And then last but not least, kind of my catch-all category, some other areas that didn't quite fit neatly into any other specific one. Computer science is a very highly mentioned topic across a lot of states, as well as STEM education, and then other workforce areas like apprenticeships or work-based learning. So before I pass off to Nick and Lindsey, I should also say a thank you to all of those who have taken the time so far to provide some feedback on our governor's one-pagers. We're taking all this information and then helping folks to use that and put it in a presentable manner that we can help publicize to spread the word about the good work that you're all doing in your state. So really appreciate that, and we continue to look forward to working on those with folks as well. So with that in mind, I'll pass it off here to Nick and Lindsey, and we'll start out with just a couple of general questions, let them share some of their thoughts, and then we'll transition to more of a Q&A portion where you all get to ask some questions, so get those ready. So first question to Nick and Lindsey, tell us about your first few months on the job as a GEPA. What are some of the things that you know now that you wish you had known then?
All right,
Go
great.
ahead,
Well,
Lindsey, since you had enough gumption to actually show up in person.
well, it was a closer drive for me, Nick. Anyway, well, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be here and just lend my voice to the chorus of congratulations for being chosen for this role. I think it is one of the coolest and certainly one of the most important in state government. So it's exciting times. I think we sort of glazed over it, but Scott mentioned it briefly. I think this is a time of tremendous change and opportunity in education, and particularly with the recent reauthorizations of both the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and Perkins. There is so much going on right now and so many new opportunities for states to be leading the way on rethinking everything from accountability systems and how we think about low-performing schools and support in school improvement systems to CTE and workforce, and fitting all of those together, and how do we use school improvement as an opportunity to be to be bettering workforce pipelines. So it's just a tremendously exciting time to be doing the work that you're doing. Possibly even a more exciting time than when I was in the role. So anyway, just a couple, I think we're asked to share just a couple of things we really wish we'd known early on. And I think for me, I've got 4 initial things to tell you. The first is ground yourself in the data of your state. And in the data of the education system. And that is everything from basic demographics. How many kids are there? How many kids per grade? How many high schools do you have? Do you have vocational high schools, or are they programs in schools? Just all of kind of the nitty gritty of what does the education system look like in your state? And then a good set of outcomes data. So what percentage of kids graduate? How does that differ by subgroup? What do academic achievement scores look like? What kind of assessments are you using? Just so that you have a real deep sense of what your system is, and that you can engage in really meaningful conversations when people come to you with ideas, with thoughts, when your boss asks you questions. You are coming from a place of really having concrete information. The second, and I think Scott alluded to this earlier too, is it pays to invest in relationships with key stakeholders. And I define key stakeholders and the folks it's really important, at least it was really important for me to have relationships with, people who are wandering legislative hall, talking to legislators, they are sitting in meetings, they are not necessarily, I mean, they can be the actual Senate and House education chairs, but sometimes it's their key staff member, sometimes it's the policy liaison from the business roundtable. I mean, whoever it is, the people who you can get on the phone when you are building a coalition, trying to move a policy through, especially as we come into summer, now's a great time to call them up and get coffee and see if you can exchange cell phone numbers and start a text chain, because the number of times that came in handy when we were trying to get legislation through or trying to set up a meeting quickly or, do that sort of thing was just too many to count. Three, I think it's really, really easy to be overwhelmed and get distracted in the job of GEPA. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of day-to-day stuff. There's a lot, once you've looked under the hood, as Scott said, there are so many things you can get really excited about fixing and improving and doing. And I think it is, as hard as it is to pick one to maybe, could be one, maybe no more than three really top priorities, and wake up every day trying to drive those through. I think doing a few things well and staying really laser focused, especially on the big things that you're going to try to use your boss's capital to support, is a really helpful way to think about it. And then four, as Scott also mentioned, really remembering the resources at your disposal. I think it took me almost till the end of my time as GEPA to actually try to meaningfully tap out, particularly out-of-state networks of and organizations. I think there are an army. We're really lucky in education. We've got a lot of well-resourced, really smart, well-funded organizations that sit here in DC that are liberal to conservative, reformy to traditional. Whatever you are in your state, there is a place for you to come and get the kind of help you need. And just to do that first, don't feel like you've got to have a fully fledged proposal or a piece of legislation before you reach out. If you're just thinking you might want to do something to improve educator preparation programs, call and ask. Some people have one-pagers, people have documents, people will have conversations with you, and that is just a hugely helpful resource. So I think I'll stop there and let Nick have a chance.
All right. Well, thanks, Lindsey, and thanks everybody for being on this webinar. And congratulations for being the dog that caught the bus. So I guess you caught it a few months ago, but as you can see, you maybe learned how to get a little bit of a drink out of the fire hose that hit you in the face, and certainly I can vouchsafe all the suggestions that Lindsey has given, and just to add a couple more in addition to that. One of the most fundamental things based on your amount of time, and certainly what Lindsey said about it's very easy to end up doing everything and accomplishing nothing. And so one thing, it's very important to learn how to say no. You've got however many millions of people in your state, hundreds of advocacy groups, lobbyists, everybody that's got an agenda. They all are equally, giving them the benefit of the doubt, equally worthy of your time. And you have got to support your boss, and don't let your boss figure this out for you. You need to help your boss figure out which of those priorities, based on your boss's interests, do you need to bring to their attention. I'd also say take advantage, as Lindsey mentioned, of the resources at your disposal, including signing up for newsletters. I probably get my best material from the NGA Education and Economic Development Division's weekly newsletter, and that's usually my best way of figuring out what's the new publication that so-and-so group is put out. So there's hundreds of think tanks, as Lindsey said, on the full spectrum of ideologies and areas in education. So looking at some of these groups that are working for you to be an aggregator like NGA that can put all that together in some sort of a form where you get a weekly newsletter that can help you wade through that is very important. Don't outsource drafting legislation if you can help it. You're probably not going to come into this unless you're an attorney or previous experience, learn how to draft legislation. I've found that if you can draft your own legislation, get some legislative sponsors to be your champions, and that's all part of the politics, is figuring out how to generate your own little team of advisors and folks that you can pitch ideas off of. And be discreet and learn who you can trust and who you can't trust. You're not always going to be working with good people, believe it or not. Some people are looking to get you in trouble. So make sure that you are vetting through those relationships to make sure that you know who you can trust and who you can't. Err on the side of caution. And then certainly you have to figure out how to navigate the policy and the politics and the process of the legislative process, the governing process, and you have a different role in each one of those. And your boss has unique capabilities, particularly in the process and the politics. But one power that you do have, if a GEPA, hey, I said GEPA. Everybody heard that. I usually say GEPA. One power that a GEPA has is the convening power. So it's very rare that if the governor's education advisor calls and wants somebody to come to a meeting, even if they all disagree with each other, you can at least get them into the room. And if you can be a calming force, if you can set yourself up to be a trusted broker, don't show your cards all the time. Kind of keep your powder dry. Don't set yourself up to be, a virulent pro or con on anything. And you can use your convening power to sort of be a sluice that people can run through ideas, and you can build up some trust. And just like your boss has got political capital, a GEPA can have trust capital or sort of that social capital with legislators that's going to help grease the skids a lot for your boss. And I'll just round it out by saying, and I said this in the first one, probably freaked some people out, although I know everybody, certainly Lindsey and everyone else understands this, is that you've got to have a strong work ethic if you're going to do this job well. You probably figured out by now this is not a 9-to-5 gig, and you have to put pretty much 7 days a week in some cases, and many hours. So if you're trying to shortchange that or take the easy way around reading, actually diving in and doing the reading yourself and mastering it, you probably just need to do that. And then lastly, I'll say, understand what the powers of your boss is. And a lot of and I know we're going to get to the federal question, so I'll save my points on that for later, but that your boss has a lot of power under WIOA and Perkins in regard to the leadership set-asides across federal legislation. Many governors don't even know what their role is, and certainly many agencies are not inclined to share with them that they have more agency than maybe they would have thought. So do look into what the power, particularly under WIOA and Perkins, is for your boss in regard to those leadership funds, because that's one tool you can use to set the tone statewide around big priorities around education and workforce, is to use your leadership funds for statewide activities.
Great. So you guys just shared a lot of great advice on things that you think are great for GEPAs to know that, again, maybe wasn't evident right off the bat. Another aspect that I think might not have been evident right off the bat are both opportunities and challenges. So I'm wondering if you both could maybe talk briefly, and we could start with Nick this time, about some of the challenges and or opportunities that you encountered once you were in your role.
I'd say the biggest challenge that you're going to face coming into your role is figuring out where you stand in the office politics and how important, your boss considers your role on the pecking order, who you report to. Navigating all through that is key to making yourself indispensable in your role. And so some governors, if they're an education governor, you may meet with them every day and they call you on your personal cell phone. And if they don't feel like that's something, that you've done wrong, your boss, every governor is going to have a different way that they interact with staff. So don't allow yourself to be demoralized. And that, I guess, is an opportunity and a challenge. You can allow yourself to become demoralized just through the day-to-day egress and ingress of office politics. Some days you're up, some days you're down. But if you stay focused on creating an agenda that helps stakeholders outside of your office get around, that's how you can shore up your own position within your own office. So if your boss sees that the economic development community or the workforce community or umpteen other groups are very inclined to support some of your ideas, even though you might have some jerk that's your immediate supervisor that's trying to, undercut you in your position, if you've got all the people that funded your boss's campaign and all the folks that are supporting your boss coming up and saying, hey, I kind of like this guy or gal, it's going to be very hard for you to get pigeonholed in a way. But be careful with that too, because obviously you don't want to cut off your nose to spite your face. But so figure out what your role is and where you stand within the dynamic of your office. And, if needed, learn how to build coalitions outside of your office to support yourself, your boss, not yourself.
Okay. So on the challenges front, I think for me, the biggest challenge I faced was just how political the education space was. So I was a GEPA during sort of the peak of the peak of the start of the backlash of, sort of the opt-out movement and some resistance to Common Core and anti-testing and teacher eval and all evaluation. I was in a blue state, so there was just a lot, it was just hyper-politicized. And that, as a consequence, meant that everyone had an opinion and had a strong one, including every member of the legislature, and also meant that a huge volume of both positive and negative legislation policy proposals were always working their way through the system. So my final year as a GEPA, which was 2015, I guess my final full year, 40% of bills introduced in the Delaware State Legislature were related to education. And they were all in my lap compared to all of the other policy sort of advisors and other folks who were there. So it was a big job for that reason. Really, I think when it's hard, when things are hyper-politicized, there are low levels of trust, there's a lot of media scrutiny, and trying to get out of that is challenging. I think on the plus side, speaks to opportunities, the politics of education are super weird. And so often you can form really unlikely and helpful coalitions outside of the usual boxes. So as an example for me, my governor was known as a pretty lefty blue state governor on a lot of issues, but on education, he was sort of more moderate and really cared about working with the business community and others. And our very best friends in the legislature were the Senate Republican caucus. And we got a lot done by collaborating with the Senate Republican caucus. So, so think and look differently. Education doesn't look like almost any other issue area in a state. I think the two other big opportunities are really key powers of the governor's office that it can be, I think can sometimes be easy to forget. The first, and Nick alluded to this, as the agenda setting power. So like you can't always decide how something is going to turn out, but you can always decide that you want something to be on the agenda. And if you want your state talking about something, if you think teacher pay is a big issue, or you think revamping CTE is a big issue in your state, you can make sure the state talks about that. And that is a really huge power. So, you don't want to pick too many of those things and get your state trying to talk about too many things at once. I think that's a recipe for what Nick described as doing a lot but not accomplishing anything. But picking one or two big things you want to put on the agenda each year and really get the state focused on. I think the other big power of a governor's office, and that is really unique to a governor's office, is the power to bridge and work across silos. And at a time when thinking about workforce strategies is just about at the top of every governor's list, the ability to work with your departments of education and your K-12 Department of Education, your institutions of higher ed, your business communities, your labor department, getting all those people in a room is something that almost nobody but the governor can do. So that's a big power, and figuring out how to use that and having to use the governor's office to beat some people's heads together and say, no, we are all going to do something together and figure out how to move this together, I think is a really, really big opportunity.
Yeah, same with issues like early childhood and others.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So that's great advice on both those questions. So before we go to the open Q&A portion, I just wanted to give you both one last opportunity. Any other just pieces of advice that you'd like to provide before we jump into the next portion?
I guess I'll start and let Nick have the last word here. So I think, we've just talked about some of them, but I think some key things, remembering these unique powers of the governor's office, thinking outside the box politically. Nick also mentioned this a little bit, being really smart about how you manage your annual calendar. So like if your legislature is a part of your legislature, thinking about what are the things that I need to drive through, how often are the committees going to meet, what do I need to get, is there a key piece of legislation that I can't move the governor's priority unless I do it by the end of this session, making sure you're on top of all that. but then possibly even more importantly, using the non-legislative time well. So build relationships. That's the time to draft big things. That's the time to be reaching out to external groups and getting policy support, making sure that you're really conscious of the calendar and sort of have a plan. And then lastly, I think really relish the experience. I mean, this is just such a special job, a special time, and it's a lot going on. But I think from those of us who have been in it and are now out, I still say to my former boss, like, you've given me possibly the best job I will ever have. And that's a really special thing if you can internalize that while you're in it. It's even more fun than internalizing it when you're out of it. So, and Nick.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what you mentioned earlier about convening everybody, you can always go with the tactic and breaking down silos that the meetings are going to continue until morale improves.
Exactly.
Just wear them out. Bring everybody together until they can come to a consensus. One thing that I would like to note on the federal side, take advantage of waiver opportunities right now as a state. I mean, whether you're on the left or the right politically, there's probably never going to be a better time for a state to have favorable consideration of a waiver request on education or workforce issues. And so just an example, Governor Ivey last week got approved to have a waiver to allow 14-year-olds and up to use individual training accounts through WIOA if they're in-school apprentices. So a couple other states have done that, but just as you, and this is a good time to think of those things because you're putting together now your Perkins plan and your WIOA plan. And a note on those federal plans, you have a consultation role in putting together the Perkins plan and the WIOA plan, and it shouldn't be reviewing the plan after it's all put together. And you should really demand of your SEA, of your SHEO, of whoever else is involved and if you don't have a seat at the table, then make one, because you have the right to be involved by statute in the development of your Perkins plan and your WIOA plan. And in many cases, I don't know the dynamic in every state, but a lot of times, just like on the governor's authority and the leadership fund, they're not looking to give you any more influence over it than you take for yourself. So it's not to say that you should micromanage it or set yourself up to be a ne'er-do-well or a pariah. But if you're not exercising your agency over it, then guess who's going to be holding the bag if they screw it up and the media picks up what a botched plan you got? It's not going to be whatever person on the labyrinth of your state education department is going to be your boss wearing that around their neck. So just make sure that, and that's an example of many other things that do not don't allow yourself just through fear or oversight to allow your boss to be wearing something around their neck that you could have prevented.
And if you don't mind, before you open it up, I'll just say, since I shouldn't have skipped the federal, but Nick's made so many good points on it, I would just say, there's really great reasons to care deeply about the federal and think about where you are on those programs. And I'll mention three. One is obviously the resources and funding, and there's much more flexibility than there's ever been before there. And so understanding the full array of what you have, because sometimes when you go to your folks in the agency, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but it's true, they who have managed a particular stream of title for a particular time will say they don't have flexibility that you really do. So understanding those funds and how they can advance your agenda. The second is obviously leverage, right? Sometimes there are requirements that are burdensome and some of those requirements that are useful. And, we have to take action in these low performing schools, or we have to present these data or other things. And these are opportunities, and you can say, look, don't blame me, right? This is a requirement, and how can I use that effectively? And the third is really the flexibility that Nick offered. I think there are a lot of opportunities, both under the law, including things like ESSA, but also given the current political dynamics, to really think about maximizing waivers and that flexibility. Obviously, there's a lot happening in ESSA implementation as we move from initial accountability to data reporting to school improvement to amendments and continuous improvement. A lot happening around higher education, and still a real push around the Higher Education Act. So happy to talk about that if helpful. And then a lot happening on the early childhood side as well, in terms of opportunities for additional state leadership around preschool development grants and other things that hopefully people are taking advantage of. And I should say the chance to tie career technical education with ESSA and think about how those things roll in the right direction is really a unique thing. So the federal matters, and we can certainly come back if there are questions about any of that, but I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you guys both for your comments, and Scott for that quick federal update. With that in mind, we have about 15 minutes left, so we wanted to open it up for questions. I believe we can either do verbal questions or folks can type it into the chat box. We'll give you a little bit of time here, as I'm sure folks are still processing.
And I think we're going to try to unmute all attendees, so just know that also if you're like, you know, in a crowded place.
Or if you're jamming out to Katy Perry or something in the office.
That's always embarrassing.
They can remute themselves if they wish.
Yeah, you can remute, yeah. Well, folks may still be thinking about things, so I just have one other question as folks are still thinking that I wanted to pose to Nick and Lindsey. Again, while they're talking, if you come up with a question, feel free to type it into the chat box and we'll make sure we answer it. But to both of you, looking back, what would you say is the accomplishment that you're most proud of during your time as a GEPA? I know, Lindsey, you alluded to you felt like it was the best job you ever had. So what was your favorite part?
Yeah, so I think for me, I think of two. I think the first was a success. The second was more a success at getting an issue on the table than it was moving it forward, but sometimes those are still important things to do. So the thing I'm proudest of during my time of GEPA, as GEPA was a college access initiative that I was really charged with leading. And we did it as a state in partnership with the College Board, but we had school day universal SAT in Delaware. And as a result, we were able to identify college-ready high school kids who were not applying to college anywhere, who weren't ascending their score reports. And these are then through through a year-long initiative that now has been replicated and is still going on. We identified, hounded, supported, and got every single one of those kids, which is not a huge number in Delaware, but possible in Delaware, to some kind of higher education institution, including a woman who's actually on the front page of the New York Times who was going absolutely nowhere and ended up going to Stanford. And so that was really driven out of our office. It was driven by the power of the governor's office to bring in different partners and work together. And so there are now, I feel like, kids in college who are in college because I worked on that. And that's a really powerful, special feelings. I think the other thing I'm really proud of is we started a much needed conversation about improving our teacher compensation system and our career ladder system for educators in Delaware. And it was as you might imagine, a sort of very complicated, very charged conversation, and one that is still going on. But I think that is, and certainly it's now in light of the last year or two popping up all over the nation. I think a conversation states need to have, the country needs to have about how we give educators better access to real professional career trajectories and then meaningful compensation that matches that. So I'm proud also of driving that work.
Should be.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say that our greatest accomplishment thus far has actually happened last week. Governor Ivey launched her first education initiative called Strong Start, Strong Finish. It had three components. One was a focus on early childhood education, birth through age 8, and then computer science, and then setting a post-secondary attainment goal. And then we introduced 3 pieces of legislation, comprehensively addressed each one of those phases, and really have gotten the entire state behind those 3 elements of Strong Start. And we've put together 5 benchmarks: pre-K readiness, school readiness, literacy and numeracy, college and career exploration, and college and career readiness to kind of fill out each 3 of those phases of Strong Start. And each 3 of those the bills that we were running through the legislature this year, they all passed almost unanimously. We had 2 folks in the House of Representatives that voted against the literacy bill, but beyond that, the governor was able to launch an education initiative, was then able to introduce legislation, and then get it passed through the legislature nearly unanimously, and that set us up really to further that effort in our combined CTE and WIOA plan and we're pulling in IDEA and ESSA as we make some amendments to make sure that our entire education workforce system is aligned. So we've used this initial Strong Start initiative that really kind of started out just as a framework, and we added meat on the bone, got the bills passed, and then now that's opened up a broader platform for the governor to kind of unquestionably be the authority, leading authority on education in the state, and it's kind of made up for a bit of a power vacuum, just for reasons I won't get into, for the last several years. So that has been a great success. So on the legislative front, I may just retire now because I'm sure that is not ever going to happen again that way. And a lot of the success of those bills was because we had greater, more existential issues that were hanging over the heads of those that would have probably opposed those bills. So it was mostly luck and circumstance that got them through, but nevertheless, we're excited to have them.
Well, they say, it's when preparation meets opportunity. So you're living the dream, Nick. Congratulations. That's good.
Well, folks have had some time to think, so we'll see if anyone had any other questions that may have popped up. I'll employ my teacher, pause for 8 seconds before we say anything else. It's all good. Well, I just want to chime in too, and I imagine, Scott, you would probably agree, but just to echo what Lindsey was saying about, feeling like being a GEPA was the greatest job she has had. And I will say I've never been a GEPA, but I had the opportunity to work in government at one point, and I would say that I feel the same way and take advantage of that opportunity when you get it, because it's there. It's not going to be there forever, and you have a tremendous opportunity, like you've just heard today, to do some amazing things. And, hopefully you end up in a position like Nick, where you've got some great confluence of events where things can happen.
And Nick, my experience has been that there's some course taught in the South that I didn't get about phrasing and stories that I have not heard before. It's really easy to do everything and accomplish nothing. But I don't know if you are paraphrasing or something, but I'm gonna quote you on that. I think that's really brilliant. And I agree. Like, all of us who have been in and out of government, it's still the government work we look back on at whatever level and role, and think about the really important opportunity it was. But we want to acknowledge it's hard to always feel that in the moment, right? The challenges of the politics and the day-to-day is a lot. So if you can try to separate what's most important from what otherwise would eat up all the time, and choose those few priorities, and have those kinds of accomplishments that both Nick and Lindsey pointed to, that I think are quite powerful. First of all, I think you'll really enjoy and get a lot of the experience. And second, those of us who are, depending on whatever state you're in, your citizens will thank you very much for the unbelievable amount of hours you're going to work, to the point that Nick made as well. So thank you.
Well, everybody here is welcome to come down to Alabama, and you can spend some time with the governor, and you can learn some of the Ivy aphorisms. That's certainly where all those things are.
Awesome. That could be a whole trip. We could book it for a group tour.
On the subject of great phrases, my boss used to say, the problem in education is that everybody thinks they're an expert because everybody went to school.
Right.
And of course, anybody who actually works in education policy knows that these are wildly complicated systems with intractable problems, centuries in the making, and that it takes a lot of sort of effort and training and focus to be really good. But that doesn't mean that every member of the state legislature will not believe that he or she is as expert, if not more so than you are, at all of the issues you're dealing with. So anyway, but I wish you the best of luck. And I'll say, if it's ever helpful, I am personally happy in my official or unofficial capacity to chat. And I'm sure, I know you've got great resources at NGA. Something I neglected to say earlier when talking about the importance of tapping outside resources is that it is totally impossible to navigate the world of DC policy organizations sitting, even sometimes in DC, but certainly sitting in a state when you have no time. So call NGA, say, this is what I want to work on, and help put me in touch, and they'll help you figure it out. I think it was not always clear. Somebody must be working on educator prep programs or on teacher compensation or college access, and I just don't know who that is, and how would I even figure that out? And the way you figure it out is you call John, and he figures it out for you and says, well, call Lindsey, and she's happy to talk to you, and we'll talk for free and be happy to help. So just don't forget that you've got friends and people cheering you on, and we are delighted to work with you. I would say the other thing that came up, and I said it sort of I think applies whether you are in a blue or a red state, is blame the feds when it's convenient and take advantage of the flexibility when it benefits you. And I got a lot of mileage and a lot of situations about, that's not us, that's the Fed, even if I was fully in agreement with whatever the federal law or policy was that was pushing us in a particular direction. So that can be a helpful tool.
Well, thank you for that endorsement, Lindsey.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. I will add on a personal note that I think I speak for all my colleagues when I say that the best parts of our day are when a state reaches out to us and asks us for our help, because that's why we joined NGA, because we're here for you all and we want to help you all. So before we close, just want to give Scott opportunity. Do you have any last words you'd like to share?
Just say thank you. And again, we're all at your disposal if we can be helpful. And you should call John day or night. Weekend, don't hesitate is my main.
I have to make sure that my calls aren't forwarded to my cell phone now. Well, thank you so much for participating in the webinar, and for those who are watching remotely. Again, we're here for you. We're here to connect you with folks like Scott, like Lindsey, like Nick. So feel free to reach out to us, during business hours, of course. And we're always here to do what we can to try to make your lives easier and make sure that education policy is going in the direction that it needs to go. So thank you very much, and keep in touch.
Well, and on the way out, I'll say, John, that not only is NGA a great resource, and certainly concur with what Lindsey said there, but she might not be able to put a plug in for her own organization, but I will do so and say that they have been extraordinarily helpful to us this year in our legislative session, to many legislators, and have given some wise counsel on many topics. So they're also a great resource.
Thanks, Nick.
All right, great. Have a good day.